On his 18th birthday, a boy who'd spent half his life in the system walked out of the county group home with a duffel bag, a manila envelope, and the name of a property no one had bothered to fight over. What he found inside wasn't just a smokehouse. It was a way of doing things so old the world had forgotten it, and so rare that the world, eventually, came looking. If you've ever felt written off, like your only inheritance was other people's pity, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to exist in the state's ledger. That's not a complaint. It's just the arithmetic of the foster system. You turn 18. You stop being a liability. You stop being a resource. You stop being anyone's responsibility. Mrs. Gable handed me the envelope and the exit paperwork on the same morning. Her face had that look I'd seen on a dozen caseworkers before her, permanently etched with tired sympathy, the kind worn so long it stopped meaning anything. The bag I carried out held everything I owned in the world. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 T-shirts, one of them missing a button. A worn paperback copy of a book about woodworking I'd checked out from the group home shelf so many times the spine had cracked and been taped back 3 times over. And a photograph, cracked along one corner, of a man I barely remembered standing next to a pen of large black and white hogs in front of a low wooden building. He was grinning like the sun had come up specifically to agree with him. Mrs. Gable handed me $400 in an envelope and said, "Good luck, Leo," in a voice that was flat as the gray sky pressing down outside the window. That was the whole ceremony. No cake. No handshake. The slush outside was the color of old dishwater, and the wind off the street smelled like exhaust and cigarette smoke and disinfectant from the hallway behind me. I pulled my jacket tighter and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not sure which direction to start walking. Then I opened the second envelope. I had no idea the paper inside was about to change everything. The letter inside directed me to the office of a Mr. Finch, an attorney whose address was 3 bus transfers and about 40 miles north of the city. I looked at the photograph in my bag again. The man, the hogs, the low wooden building. Then I put it away and started walking toward the bus stop. Mr. Finch's office was a narrow room above a hardware store in a town I'd never heard of. The stairs creaked under every step. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and furniture polish, and the man behind the desk looked as though he had grown there, slowly, over decades, like a knot in wood. He was thin, with white hair combed neatly over his head, and he looked at me over his spectacles as I came through the door and sat down without being invited to, because there was only one chair and it was obvious. "Leo Vance," he said. His voice was a dry rustle, like gravel stirred with a spoon. "Yes, sir." "Thomas Vance was your grandfather." "I know. He didn't offer condolences. He didn't ask how I was doing. He simply opened a folder, smoothed it with one careful hand, and told me the facts. My grandfather had passed 8 months ago. He had owned 45 acres on the ridge above the Cooley Creek Valley, including a farmhouse, a smokehouse, several outbuildings, and a small herd of something called Ossabaw Island hogs. A heritage breed, he explained, that most of the country had never heard of. He had left all of it to me. I waited for the catch. The back taxes owed come to $4.11, Mr. Finch said, which I've taken the liberty of rounding to an even 4. $4, I said. $4. I had 400. I could do $4. He also told me, looking at his papers without looking at me, that Summit Creek Estates had been making inquiries about the property for the better part of 3 years. Their representative had contacted Mr. Finch's office just last week. They were prepared to offer $5,000 for the land, as is, immediately. It was, Mr. Finch allowed, a modest offer. But given that the farmhouse was uninhabitable, the herd had been managed by a neighboring farmer on a handshake arrangement, and the smokehouse hadn't been in operation for close to a decade, he understood why a young man with no resources might consider it. I thought about $5,000. I thought about a security deposit on an apartment. I thought about what it would mean to sleep somewhere without checking whether the door locked properly. "I'm not selling," I said. It came out before I'd finished deciding. "It's mine. I want to see it." It was the most impractical thing I had ever said. Standing outside Mr. Finch's office an hour later, with his brief instructions in my pocket, and the cold working its way through my jacket, I was almost certain it was also a mistake. I'm glad I made it anyway. The bus let me out at the end of a county road with a hand-lettered sign that read Coulee Creek 3 MI and nothing else. The road going in was a logging track, mostly frozen mud at this time of year, and I walked it with the duffel over one shoulder and the photograph in my jacket pocket. The air changed within the first half-mile. The exhaust smell dropped away. The trees thickened on both sides, pine and bare oak, and something darker I didn't have a name for, and the cold felt cleaner. Somehow, less angry. More honest. About halfway in, I found a payphone bolted to a post outside a small gas station. The man inside, Henry, a heavy-set fellow with a gray mustache and permanent squint, watched me through the window as I counted change into the slot and called the number for the children's home, where my sister Maya was still waiting. She was 14. I'd promised. I'd come for her. "Does it have a roof?" she asked when I told her. "I'll find out soon," I said. "Leo," her voice was quieter. "Don't make promises you can't keep." "I'm going to fix it up," I said. "I'm going to make it a home. And then I'm going to come for you. I promise." There was a pause on the line. "Okay," she said. Finally, just okay. But it was the kind of okay that had weight to it. Henry, when I hung up, came out of the station and looked me over with the practiced appraisal of a man who'd seen a good deal of life come down that road. "Thomas Vance's grandson?" he said. "Yes, sir." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Last time I saw your grandfather, he was out front of the county commissioner's office with a hand-painted sign, fighting the grading permit for that development up the ridge. Man didn't back down from anything." He paused. "You look like you've been through a war and lost twice." "About right," I said. He pointed me the rest of the way in. What I saw when the track opened up made my chest sink. The farmhouse was worse than uninhabitable. Half the porch had fallen in, and the windows on the north side were boarded over with warped plywood. The outbuildings were in varying states of collapse, but the smokehouse, low, squat, built of stone up to the eaves with a timber frame above. Roof intact, door solid on its hinges, that it held. It stood slightly apart from the other structures, set back from them like a man who decided not to fall just because everyone around him had. I almost turned around. The weight of it settled on me like the cold, like another thing to carry. But my feet kept moving toward the smokehouse door. There was a padlock on it, and Mr. Finch had sent me with a ring of old keys. I worked through them one by one until I found the right one. It was stiff. It grated. And then, with a loud protesting screech of metal on metal, came a solid, satisfying clunk, and the lock sprang open. The door swung inward. A wave of air washed over me, musty and thick with the smell of damp earth, rust, and something deeper underneath. Something I couldn't name, something smoky and faintly sweet and very old. Shafts of dusty light cut through gaps in the timber frame high above, and my footsteps echoed off the stone walls. It was bigger inside than it looked from without. Long hanging bars ran the width of the ceiling, and along the far wall were racks and hooks and instruments I couldn't identify. In the center of the floor, there was a trapdoor, open, with a wooden crate sitting beside it. The crate was sitting there as though someone had left it recently, as though it had been waiting. I crossed the floor and knelt beside it. The lid was loose, held down by a length of twine. I worked the knot free and lifted the lid. Inside, packed in straw, were 8 glass jars. Each one was sealed tight. And in each one, through the slightly cloudy glass, I could see something I needed a moment to understand. Rolled bills, banded tight. Cash. I lifted one jar out carefully, as though it might break, as though the whole thing might dissolve if I breathed wrong. I twisted the lid. It released with a pop and a faint rush of sealed air. Inside were 20 $50 bills. $1,000. I put the jar down and sat very still, looking at the other 7. 8 jars. $1,000 a jar. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. I counted once. I counted again. I sat back on my heels and looked at the jars lined up on the stone floor in the last gray light coming through the timber frame, and something in me that had been held very tightly for a very long time simply let go. I sat down hard on the cold concrete floor. My legs had made the decision before I did. I set the last jar down beside the others, and I just sat there, breathing slowly, counting and recounting what I could not quite believe was real. $8,000. Enough to repair the farmhouse, enough to buy feed for the herd, enough to buy time. And then I made a sound, a strange, choked sound that echoed off the stone walls around me, and then I was laughing. And then the laughter turned into something else entirely. Something that came from somewhere lower and older. A deep, gut-wrenching sob that surprised me with its force. I sat there on the cold floor and let it happen. Because there was no one watching. And because it had been a very long time since I had allowed myself to feel anything that large. When I could breathe steadily again, I began replacing the jars one by one. And then, at the very bottom of the crate, beneath the last layer of straw, my hand found something else. A leather journal, slim, its cover soft and dark with years of handling. And tucked inside the front cover, a folded letter. On the outside, in careful, deliberate handwriting, 2 words, Leo Vance. I sat in the last of the light coming through the timber frame, and I unfolded it. Leo, if you are reading this, it means you found it. It means you came. That tells me more about who you are than anything I could have hoped for. I want you to know, and I need you to hear this first, before anything else, that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. You have your mother's heart, but you have my stubbornness, and I mean that as the highest compliment I am capable of giving. I am going to explain some things to you now, and I am asking you to keep reading even when it is hard to understand. When your mother passed, and the system came for you and your sister, I fought. I fought in every way I knew how to fight, but I had a debt, not of money, though that was part of it, owed to a man who had been my business partner for 11 years and who had become something else by the end. He had documentation, fabricated mostly, but convincing, that would have removed me from contention entirely. My lawyers told me I was going to lose. More than that, they told me that if I pressed the fight, he would use what he had to ensure you and Maya were placed far apart in different counties and kept apart. I made the decision no father or grandfather should ever have to make. I let go. To keep you close to each other. To keep you safe from him. He has since passed. And now I have done everything I could in the years I had left. The money in the jars will get you started. But the money is not the inheritance, Leo. The inheritance is this building. What is in this smokehouse is something the industrial food companies spent 40 years trying to erase. I have been raising Ossabaw Island hogs, a breed so old the Spanish brought them here in the 1500s, and curing their meat by methods passed down from a man named Caleb Wren, who learned them from his father, who had no idea what he was preserving. The fat on an Ossabaw is different from any commercial breed. It cures differently. It tastes like something people have largely forgotten exists. In the last 2 years, I have been quietly supplying 4 restaurants and 2 specialty grocers in the city, and every one of them has a waiting list now. The journal has all of it. The cure ratios, the timing, the temperature, the breeds, the feed, the slaughter dates. Everything. The neighboring farmer, Dale Holbrook, has been tending the herd. He knows you're coming. He'll help. There is one more thing. Inside the back of the journal, you will find the original survey from 1947 and the updated one from 1999. Look at the ridgeline carefully. The county appraiser has never noticed. Mr. Finch will explain the rest. The foundation is the key. Everything starts with the foundation. I love you, Leo. I always have. Make something. Your grandfather, Thomas Vance. I reread it twice. I reread the line, I let go, to keep you close to each other, and I had to set the letter down on the cold stone and look up at the timber ceiling for a while before I could continue. His final line was underlined twice. The foundation is the key. I closed the journal and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind work its way around the stone walls of the smokehouse my grandfather had built with his own hands, thinking about the difference between abandonment and sacrifice, and how much can look like the same thing from one side of it. The next weeks were a blur of hard physical labor. I read the journal until sections of it were memorized. I visited Dale Holbrook, who was a weathered, quiet man of about 60, who shook my hand without ceremony and showed me the herd. 14 Ossabaw sows and 2 boars, black and bristly and remarkably calm, rooting in the frost-hardened ground with the slow confidence of animals that know exactly what they are. Dale showed me the feed regime, the rotation, the way to read their condition. I watched him work without speaking much, because the work spoke for itself. I began the first cure on a cold Friday, following the journal's instructions line by line. The process was not complicated in the way that complicated things are complicated. It was slow in the way that old things are slow. Salt, thyme, cold air, smoke from a particular combination of hickory and apple wood. The ratios were exact. The timing was exact. My grandfather had notes in the margins, small adjustments, years of refinement recorded in that same deliberate handwriting, and I followed them as faithfully as I could. I chopped wood until my hands blistered and then hardened. I patched the smokehouse roof where one timber had cracked and let in weather, climbing the stone exterior with a tarp and rope on a morning so cold my breath turned solid in the air. I learned how to bank a curing fire so it would hold overnight at the right temperature, which took 4 failures before it started working consistently. I sanded the planks of the farmhouse floor with boards salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding, working room by room, and the smell of sawdust and old pine filled the evenings. I spent 2 afternoons at the county library, working through books on salt curing and cold smoking, and confirmed what my grandfather had written, that what was in that journal was not common knowledge. A woman at the circulation desk let me use the library's computer to look up the 4 restaurants my grandfather mentioned by name. 3 of them had been reviewed in city food publications. One review described a cured ossabaw pork shoulder as, and I remember the phrasing exactly, like discovering a room in a house you thought you knew everything about. George at the hardware store let me run a tab without asking questions. Martha at the diner left a box of old cast iron on my porch one morning. No explanation, no knock on the door, just the box, and a note that said use them in good health. A retired electrician named Whitmore appeared one Tuesday and grounded the wiring in the smokehouse without being asked, refused payment, and left before noon. And then, 6 weeks after I arrived, a second letter came from Summit Creek Estates. The offer was now $25,000. 2 weeks after that came a third letter, this one from their attorney, not their representative, referencing the county's blighted property ordinance and suggesting that, with the right documentation, the state could compel a sale at assessed value. I walked into Mr. Finch's office the following morning with the surveys from the back of the journal and the attorney's letter in my coat pocket. I did not know yet that it would be the most important meeting of my life. The Summit Creek Estates representatives were already there when I arrived, 2 of them in expensive suits, plastic smiles, the whole performance. They talked about community and partnership and the opportunities that responsible development could bring to the valley. They talked about progress. One of them used the word inevitability, which is the kind of word people use when they want you to feel small. Then, they made the offer. $250,000. Cash, within 30 days, no conditions. I looked at my hands, which still had the remnants of wood smoke in the creases of the knuckles that no amount of washing would fully shift. I thought about the herd moving through the cold field, the sound of their rooting in the frost. I thought about Maya asking, "Does it have a roof?" I thought about a letter that said, "Make something." I thought about a line underlined twice. "No," I said. The silence in the room had a particular quality to it. Then I took the surveys out of my coat pocket and laid them on the table. Mr. Finch, who had said nothing up to this point, adjusted his spectacles and looked at them with an expression I could not read. The 1999 survey had been done as part of a county water rights audit. What it showed, what the county appraiser had never noticed, or had noticed and never recorded, was that the ridge on my grandfather's property sat directly above a significant underground aquifer. The aquifer fed Coulee Creek. Coulee Creek fed 4 other properties downstream. The water rights, which my grandfather had quietly documented and legally filed in 1999, but which had never been contested because no one had thought the land worth contesting, were entirely mine. Summit Creek Estates needed that water for any development in the valley. They had known this. They had been hoping I hadn't. I looked at the man in the expensive suit and I spoke slowly and clearly, because I wanted to be understood. I told him I was not selling. Not any of it. What I was willing to do was this: a formal easement for water access, at rates set annually by a community trust consisting of 6 valley residents, with a conservation covenant prohibiting development within 800 feet of the aquifer's boundary, and an annual contribution to the county's Agricultural Preservation Fund. All of it binding in perpetuity. All of it on record. Or they could leave and I would see them in court, where Mr. Finch was prepared to spend a great deal of their time. The man in the expensive suit looked at his partner. His partner looked at the survey. They excused themselves and went into the hallway. They were out there for 11 minutes. When they came back, they said they would need to consult with their principals and would be in touch. Everyone in that room knew they had already lost. Summit Creek Estates agreed to every condition 3 weeks later. The signing was quiet and took about 40 minutes, and on the way home I stopped at the payphone outside Henry's gas station and called Maya. She picked up on the second ring. "It has a roof," I said. She laughed. A real one, surprised out of her. And for a moment, neither of us said anything. The custody hearing was 2 months later. I won't spend long on it, because courthouses are cold places, and the best thing I can say about that one is that I walked out of it with my sister beside me and the papers folded in my jacket pocket. She was quiet on the bus ride back, watching the trees thicken outside the window, the hills steepen, the air change. When we came around the last bend in the logging track and she saw the smokehouse, the stone walls, the thin line of smoke from the curing fire I'd banked before I left, the herd moving in the field behind it, she stopped walking. "You did it, Leo," she said. Quietly, not like a question. That night I flipped the light switch in the main room of the farmhouse. Newly rewired, newly insulated. 1 room at a time over 60 days of evenings, and the lights came on, warm and steady. It wasn't a house. It was a home. I stand on the porch now sometimes in the early morning, watching the hogs work through the pasture in the frost, and I think about what it means to inherit something. Most people think of it as receiving, as something passing to you from above. But what my grandfather gave me wasn't something he handed over. It was something he built and protected and pointed me toward. The money in the glass jars was a beginning. The journal was a map. But what he was really leaving me was the chance to do the thing he'd spent his life doing. Not just surviving, but making something that hadn't existed before. We have 11 restaurant accounts now, a small waiting list that grows every quarter. Maya handles the books, which she is much better at than I am, and she is finishing school in the valley. Dale Holbrook still comes on Tuesdays to check the herd, and we've added 4 sows. The smokehouse runs full most of the year. The aquifer continues to water the valley, and the community trust meets every spring to set the rates, and the money goes to 3 local farms that needed it. I still have the worn paperback from my duffel bag. It sits on the shelf in the kitchen. I still have the photograph in a frame now, hanging over the workbench where I do most of my curing prep. The man, the hogs, the low stone building, and that grin that agreed with the sun. My inheritance wasn't the money. It was the chance to build something instead of just surviving. And I did not know, standing in front of that smokehouse door with a ring of old keys and a near-empty duffel bag, that I was about to find both. What is the abandoned place in your life? The thing that looks worthless from the outside, that you're fighting to reclaim? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.